I'm Jacob Halbrun, the editor of the National Interest, and it is my great pleasure today to conduct yet another one of our seminars on cyber and technology. And today we have three distinguished guests, and I'm going to begin with an opening question for them, asking them, beginning with John, and then turning to Fran, and then to Sam. And my opening question is, given that the war in Ukraine has been a much more traditional conflict in many ways than we anticipated, are cyber tech prowess indeed indispensable to economic and military strength? What impact do they actually have on great power competition today? I'd like to begin with John.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. I think the question is obviously very germane to the current situation. I think that as far as national strength and national power is concerned, technological prowess, industrial strength clearly are important, if not vital factors, vital determinants, but they're just not the only ones. You've got other factors such as population, natural resources, size of country, and so forth. And then you've got human factors such as the education of the population, political will, morale, willingness to fight, and so forth. So I think that in the end, it's a multiplicity of considerations that help determine the direction of conflict. So I would only say in this case, one area where I think technology has really played an important part is in some of the weaponry that we have provided to the Ukrainians in their self-defense. And I think those have played an extremely important role in limiting the capacity of the Russian efforts.
Fran, could you weigh in on this too?
Sure. So I think we can't underestimate, in April, Microsoft talked about the increasing frequency and sophistication of Russian cyber attacks against Ukraine. And then just this month, they came out and said there's an increasing number of cyber intrusions and attacks emanating, they believe, out of Russia into the United States. And so what we're seeing really is, although we see more of the horrific pictures of physical destruction, we're in a world of what's essentially become hybrid warfare. And it's just not the attack part of cyber. We've also seen absolutely Russian disinformation. I think our tech companies have done a very good job of trying to take down Russian disinformation from US platforms. But at the same time, China has done the opposite. They've allowed Russia to use their platforms to put out disinformation. They've denied the ability for those who want to put information and pictures up about what's really going on, they block them. And so there's this tension, and it's a tension of values, it's a tension of technology. But this is, I think we ought to expect, is going to be a standard part of warfare going forward, not just in the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Sam, why don't you address this as well?
Sure. So 3 points I think are relevant here. One is that the Chinese government has, of course, long viewed technology as a tool of the state. And I think that concept is gaining traction increasingly in the West, as far as the way that US policymakers are also viewing technology as a tool of the state. And that's why we've seen this as one of the major fraction points with the US and China, but also as a global question. Specifically with Ukraine, when it comes to great power competition, and again, I'll speak to China because that's where my expertise lies, is the key question here is, will China backfill the technology that the West has denied Russia, and specifically semiconductors? And the way that shapes out will have tremendous impact on the US-China bilateral relationship and also globally. And we can talk more about what that looks like. The third, I think, is that great power competition is playing out at a moment when the rules for governing technology, and specifically the internet, have not yet been fully formed. So governments around the world are faced with this two-prong issue, which is one, how do we govern emerging technologies that we don't even know how they will shape the future? And Fran mentioned the misinformation specifically. And then the question is, how will the US and China and other great powers navigate that question? And to what extent are questions of governing emerging technology country agnostic? And to what extent are they specific to great power rivalries playing out between nations?
Wow, that's a lot to digest there. I guess I will, bouncing off we'll come back to a lot of what you were talking about. John, I'm wondering about her reference to semiconductors. What is your take on the China-Taiwan confrontation in that regard? How aggressive do you think China will be?
Well, I'm not in the school that believes that some kind of invasion of Taiwan by China is imminent. Unless Taiwan was so foolish as to declare independence. But short of that, I think you're just going to have this uneasy truce that continues for a long period of time. Related to that, and the question that Sam asked about, was China going to backfill the Russian capability in light of the sanctions that we have been taking against Russia? Well, I think even if they do, I'm not sure how much that in the specific case of Ukraine is going to affect the outcome. I think to come back to Jacob's original question, I think we are bogged down in a sort of a World War II or maybe a Korea type situation. And I'm not sure there's much that's going to alter the fact that Russia is consolidating its position in eastern Ukraine, and we're probably going to have some kind of armistice or truce without a final political resolution, very much a la Korea, for the foreseeable future. I just don't see that changing, and I'm not sure that tech is going to play a particularly great role in that.
That's interesting. I mean, the Ukrainians are relying, of course, on drones and countering Russian cyber warfare. It just looks like it hasn't been as effective as we anticipated, right?
Right, but I mean, I'm talking about Russia's ability to do what it's doing and what makes it a great power. And I don't think it's only technology. It's also incredible determination and political will to do what it's doing, right?
Right. Fran, do you have any thoughts on that?
So going back to the Taiwan question, I agree with John that I don't think that that's imminent, but I do think the Chinese are watching and learning from Russia's mistakes, right? Putin believed he was going to go in and take Kyiv. This was a days and weeks problem, not a months and years issue as far as he was concerned. And so he sorely underestimated the capability of his own military and their ability to lay supply chains, right? Logistics chains. And so I think very clearly in an autocracy like China or Russia, you have to ask yourself, is your military being honest with you when your military hasn't fought in decades a foreign conflict? Are they being honest with you about their actual capability to execute in a conflict? The other thing I think that two other lessons I think the Chinese take away from the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the reaction to it is the swift and severe implication of sanctions. And then thirdly, the unity, the unexpected, I think, on Putin's part, unity between NATO and our European allies in the United States and how quickly that came together. Now, we'll see if it holds when gas supplies are tight in Europe and gets colder in the winter. I would hope that that didn't affect the strength of the allyship. But I think that they've seen that the strength of unity, the sanctions, and the lack of an understanding of their own military's capability, all those will be factors in how they look at and consider a conflict in Taiwan.
I jump in with one quick one before Sam comments on China. and simply that I think that any attack on Taiwan now or in the foreseeable future would come at a moment when I think there is a greater political will in this town to come to the defense of Taiwan and respond to an attack by China than there has been for a long, long time.
Why do you think that's the case?
I don't think there's much strategic ambiguity anymore. Well, because I think, first of all, the adverse feelings towards the People's Republic of China in Washington, and secondly, Taiwan has played its cards very well in this town.
Sam, how devastating would a Chinese attack be for the U.S. since we seem to be reliant on them for semiconductors? And what's your take?
So I'll answer that question, I think, by delinking two pieces of it. How devastating would it be? I recommend a book by my friend Christian Brose, The Kill Chain, which is a pretty devastating look at what would happen to our side in a Taiwan conflict. And I think as the sound of war drumbeats builds in Washington to take on Xi Jinping in Taiwan, let's keep that in mind. This is not a conflict we want to get into without devastating consequences. As a mother, not as a China analyst, this scares the out of me. But two, the question of semiconductors. So I think the fact that TSMC is in Taiwan is the most important deterrent on both sides to a conflict in Taiwan, because there is nothing like it at this point, and both sides understand that. So if there is going to be a war in Taiwan, I think the safest place to be would it be in a TSMC facility, because neither side is going to want to target that.
And does China actually have the ability to backfill for Russia?
I don't think they have the intent. And I certainly think they don't want to. There has been no signal from Beijing that they want to step into backfill. One. And two, when it comes to advanced semiconductors, it depends on what kind of semiconductor technology we're talking about, but let's keep in mind that for decades, the Chinese government has thrown billions of dollars and policy support at trying to wean off reliance on foreign technology, specifically in the advanced semiconductor space, and they just haven't been able to do it. Now, there was a sea change that happened with ZTE and Huawei being placed on the entity list and cut off the lifeline, their supply, which I think this has made the Xi administration really double down in terms of saying, hey, this is a national security, crucial point of national security vulnerability. So let's get our act together. So we'll see if they can. But this is something they have tried for decades to do and have not been able to successfully.
Well, I promised to pose questions from our audience, and we've just gotten one from Christian Whitten, who served in the Trump State Department as a political appointee. And he asks, did we make a mistake in assuming that Russian cyber capabilities would resemble our own? Fran, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Look, the probably four greatest cyber powers in the world. When you say resemble our own, I start with let's talk about capabilities as opposed to resembling, right? Is the US, Russia, China, and Israel is who I put in the top four. There are other contenders, near contenders, but, and we have a pretty good sense because Russia has deployed offensive weapons against Ukraine. We have access to those weapons and can reverse engineer and understand pretty well what Russia's capability is. And so I don't think we over or underestimated Russia's capability. What you can't know for sure until you're in a conflict is how and when will they deploy it. I think people were surprised to the person's question that Russia did not more quickly and sooner deploy some of these weapons targeting the US. They remained focused on Ukraine for the beginning parts of the war. But we can't rely on that. And I think that a lot has been done. I give the administration a lot of credit. A lot has been done to work with the private sector to ensure our preparedness and defenses.
John, I wonder what you think. I mean, we haven't had some of the apocalyptic scenarios that were sketched out before this conflict. There's been no shutdown of the electric grid in the United States, nuclear power plants, or those kinds of things that people, or the banking system. What do you think about this issue of Russian capabilities?
Well, I'm going to defer to Sam and others on the capabilities, but as far as the fact that they haven't used them quite as extensively as they might have, although Fran alluded earlier to the ways in which they have been using them, I think it's an indicator that they're willing to, follow some boundaries and some limits. And somebody back there must have judged that there are risks, there would be risks involved in that kind of behavior that they're not sure they want to undertake at this particular point in time. And if I can try to disable your electrical grid, maybe you can disable mine. And do I really want to have to live through that particular kind of situation when my focus is on the geography of Ukraine?
Sam?
I think I'm going to pass on this one. It's a bit out of my area.
Okay. Okay. Another one of the issues that we should touch on, we can always return to these, is the legislation before Congress. And this might be the perfect question for you, Sam. How do you feel about these various proposals to, at least in theory, that would rein in the tech industry? Are we killing the golden goose? Are we jeopardizing our ability to compete with China, as some contend, or are these overdue privacy protections, and are the tech companies getting away with murder?
Well, so I think there are a number of different proposals, that are at play here. And one of the key questions is, how does domestic law and regulation have a geopolitical impact? Not that that should be the primary consideration when we evaluate the effectiveness of these proposals, but it's certainly something where there will be geopolitical knock-on effects that we should talk about. And I'd love to hear more of Fran's perspective on this, because I know she's written publicly about the national security implications. I have to say, I have been really skeptical of some of the criticism of the antitrust proposals about what that would mean for creating disadvantage vis-a-vis China. But I'd love to hear Fran's take, because I think she may think differently about it. One is, again, I mentioned at the beginning that there's a increasing view in Washington of technology as a tool of the state. And I think by sort of saying, look, if we break up Google and the others, that this will create a dynamic where these companies can't be the national champions we need them to be to compete with China. And then my question is, so can you be more specific? In what way does what being proposed create a specific disadvantage vis-a-vis China? And maybe there's a good answer to that, but I have not heard a concrete example of, where is that playing out? Or are we just talking about bigness and, big national champions? Because let's keep in mind also, the Chinese government has been particularly brutal on their own tech champions. Not that they are looking to break them up, but they have certainly made it very difficult to be a private sector social media company in China in the recent tech crackdown. And I think,
is that to their detriment ultimately?
Well, I think it's to their detriment. When I've spent a lot of time reading, Xi Jinping thought on being a cyber superpower. And it's interesting because the party and the Xi Jinping leadership, when they talk about aspirations to be a cyber superpower, they talk about having big Chinese tech platforms be competitive beyond China's closed borders. And the more that the Chinese government makes it appear that their own private sector is a tool of the state, the more governments around the world mistrust those companies and create regulatory barriers to allow them into the market. And so I don't think they're doing themselves any favors in their own aspirations in that way.
Go ahead.
I do think that where the competition does play out does have to do with surveillance. And when we talk about creating the sort of pipelines of the world where data will be able to be accessed, where the idea that whether it's Huawei with the infrastructure or whether it's global data flows with the apps that sit on top, this is an area where the US has had dominance in global surveillance. And to the extent that Chinese tech companies are able to challenge the dominance in that area, that does have specific national security strategic implications.
So how much of the mistrust do you think is justified? I mean, there was a big brouhaha here in DC down to the fact that they were going to buy subway cars made in China, and their contention was that they would be bugged and so forth. I mean, how wary are you?
Of subway cars?
Not just, I'm just using that as an extreme example.
I think what we're seeing is, starting the Trump administration and continuing in the Biden administration, there's a view that there is a new risk frontier, and it's not the days of, cyber espionage and cyber intrusions are not going down. In fact, I think those are probably going up coming from China. But I think layered on top of it is this view that the new risk frontier is data that's acquired openly on the commercial market. And whether that's, Chinese software applications handling American citizens' data, this is an area that the Biden administration has picked up the torch where the Trump administration left off. And we've seen a number of initiatives to increasingly block data flows to China. Just last week, Senator Wyden reintroduced a bill which would essentially create a data export control regime. No other country has anything like it in the world. And so this is, I think, where policymakers in Washington are going to be focused.
So Fran, what's your take? Do you think this is a good trend?
So look, I think we have to understand, I think what Sam was saying about the unintended consequences, the unintended geopolitical consequences of domestic bills here. There are 2 antitrust bills in the Senate, 5 in the House. There's one that is in both that is the most likely, it's the furthest along. It's the American Innovation and Choice Online Act. And that's the furthest along. What we have to be careful is unintended self-inflicted wounds in terms of innovation. Look, China is still stealing our technology to the tune of about $500 billion a year. When you think about what we invest in R&D, the Department of Defense annual budget for R&D is about $109 billion. And the 6 largest tech companies alone, that's not the whole private sector, just the 6 largest tech companies is $140 billion. When you're stealing IP at the rate of $500 billion a year, you realize, right, just from a shareholder perspective, the concerns of the big tech companies. The areas, to Sam's question about where I have the greatest concerns and the areas where these bills have an anti-competitive effect geopolitically, is in things like AI, quantum computing, the 5G to 6G, artificial intelligence, microelectronics. All these areas will be impacted in terms of the competitiveness of US tech companies. And I don't think, they've not, the very well-intentioned members of Congress here, and I do, Sam, think there needs to be some regulation. I'm not saying there needs to be none, but they've not held a single hearing on the national security implications of any of these bills, not one. And I just think it's crazy, right? Because there are clear national security implications. So look, I'll stop there, but I do have real concerns about the impact of these bills and legislators not fully understanding.
So Fran and I have signed, I think, some of the same, one at least, maybe more, of the same letters on this subject. And I want to echo everything she just said, and I would only add the term open access, which is one of the terms that occurs in this legislation. They talk about making the internet available and to anybody, and if you read, the implications might even be to make it available to foreign countries at the very same time that they want to put restrictions on our own companies. I think that when you're trying to assess something as important as the high-tech industry, I think you really got to think of the global competitive environment and not merely the domestic one. But I would also agree that perhaps some domestic regulation is required, but let's at the very least have this discussion in these hearings before the Congress, before proceeding pell-mell to passing those bills.
Sam, do you have want to respond?
I want to pick up on the point that Ambassador Negroponte made about the where regulation is needed. I think that if one of the main concerns is the vast quantities of data that's held by the companies, then we should have federal privacy law, right? And I think that in some ways, the open access component and the requirements about data sharing cut in exactly the opposite direction, right? We don't have robust rules around how data can be collected and stored and shared. And so instead of creating regulation around the data that these companies hold, when the big concern is about how powerful they are because of the data, we're actually doing the opposite. We're requiring that they share that data with other parties who are also not regulated by federal privacy law, right? And so let's focus on what is the problem we're trying to solve for, and go get it at that way. Would be a good way to start.
You know, John, when you were talking about U.S. competitiveness, that I just wanted to ask you a broader question. Do you feel that the U.S. is losing its edge in high technology, which it has enjoyed since the end of World War II?
I guess the short answer would be no. I mean, when I think of the size and the dynamism of our economy, our flexibility, our ability to recover from setbacks, I don't think we operate under as many constraints as some of these other countries, whether it's China. Both China and Russia have population problems. They have difficulty retaining their intellectuals. We're the ones who have all the immigrants who come from these other countries once they've developed high-tech capabilities. By the way, that's something worth mentioning is immigration and the admission of technologists and scientists from other countries to the United States. That's been a strength of our country for more than a century, and I think a couple of centuries. And I think that trend very much ought to be encouraged through creating as the best possible access, particularly for PhD students in science and technology from foreign countries to the United States. So no, I don't think we're losing our edge. I think, in fact, no chance.
So
Fran, go ahead.
I agree with John that we remain the global leader. I think they're more nipping at our heels than John's comments might suggest. And I think we can't take our leadership in terms of innovation and technology for granted. I mean, as Sam reminds us, they declared themselves wanting to become a cyber superpower. They do support, the state does support, as Sam said, their technology companies in a way that the US private sector does not, should not get support from the US government. And then lastly, I would say, I think the thing that the Chinese do that goes unnoticed by most is their dramatically increasing activity in standard setting bodies, because they care about very much what the international rule-based system is, and setting the table to their advantage. Now, these are bodies they had not traditionally even played in, much less tried to influence outcomes in.
Sam, what is your take?
I think the standards issue is a big one. And this isn't, again, the sort of the collision of we are at a moment where the rules for technology are being set at this critical juncture in the sort of resetting of the world order and great power competition. So this is one where the U.S. has to run faster. And the Biden administration came in and said, we want to play offense. And it's about sort of how do we outcompete China rather than just creating defensive barriers around that relationship. And I'm sort of still waiting, to be honest, for where the rubber will hit the road in how we play offense, and what that's going to look like, because I do think that is the key here. And how do we make American companies that are at the forefront of innovation in these advanced fields that Fran pointed out, in AI and quantum and biotech, how do we incentivize innovation playing into the strengths of our system in a way that will help us be more globally competitive? You know, as the US and China decouple, that competition, particularly in the tech space, is not going to play out in each other's countries. That competition is going to play out in third countries. It's going to be in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in LATAM. And so the question should be, how are the actions we're taking at home going to increase our ability to run faster and compete in these other parts of the world?
Apart from the issue,
Just
go
one
ahead.
quick one on technology. You know, who invented the vaccine for COVID, the effective vaccines for COVID in record time? I mean, if you want one shining example of our proficiency in science and technology, going a little bit away from the cyber issue.
No, that is a valid point. I just, you just keep reading in the press, maybe it's being overly dramatized, that the US is more in danger of losing its edge in these arenas.
And can I say, just to Sam's point about how do you continue to encourage and incentivize in the private sector innovation, the government has to do more in terms of cracking down on the $500 billion annually of IP theft, right? Because that's the cheap way for China to catch up, right? By stealing our technology. And so I've now spent almost 15 years in the private sector. In public companies, you've got to justify these kinds of spends of capital. And it becomes harder and harder when it's going out the back door and somebody then creates a product based on your IP and sells it cheaper. And so I think the government's got to come to grips with, if you want to incentivize innovation and investment like that, you must do more about the theft of intellectual property.
And which
Do you
comes
agree?
back to the issue that we're better on offense than we are on defense, Fran, and both government-wise and in the private sector. And I think one of the issues that we've been watching for the last 15 years is a debate between the private sector and government about who pays. And I think the private sector has been sort of saying, well, après vous, Alphonse. And we got to get the private sector to be willing to pay more for some of our cyber defense.
Do you agree, Sam?
Well, so on the question of cyber defense, I think this is one where I know I keep sort of hammering this point, but some of the questions we're talking about are specific to great power rivalry, and some of them are country agnostic and are about how do we create more robust cybersecurity protections that have nothing to do with China or Russia, for example. So I look at, the obsession around companies like Huawei, right? And let's rid our, network infrastructure of foreign adversary, the Clean Network Initiative under the Trump administration, which continues, but under a different name in this administration. I think that there is a need for more robust cybersecurity measures in ways that are not taking a whack-a-mole approach at specific companies or specific countries of origin, but say, look, and this is one that gets tricky, right? Because the reason that we have not had federally mandated cybersecurity rules, we rely on recommended standards under NIST, which are risk-based, is that there is a problem when you have the pace of technology gets ahead of the ability for government to regulate it. And this creates a dilemma, right? Where I think rightfully so, when it comes to some of these areas, I think the default has been having a NIST sort of risk-based framework for cybersecurity and critical infrastructure is the most effective way to actually deal with cybersecurity challenges. But I think one of the questions now that policymakers need to grapple with is there a need for more robust, higher standards for cybersecurity in ways that can be flexible and keep pace with the development of technology? And I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I do think it's one that we need to grapple with, and we need to grapple with it in its own right, rather than just fixating on specific companies or countries of origin.
Jacob, let me jump in here because
Sure.
Something said about the private sector and stepping up. I agree with that. And I also agree with Sam. There's a utility in having more than just sort of what NIST has put out there, but more comprehensive standard setting. But there's a difference here. We're talking about state-sponsored attacks. And the real question in my mind is that really, we're expecting private sector companies to have a level of cybersecurity to protect themselves against state-sponsored attacks. Whose responsibility is that? If the Russians cross our border, the federal government is going to deal with it, not the private sector. And so this is not so different. It comes back to something Sam said about we're setting the international standards now. But here's what I would say to you. After 9/11, we set up a national insurance fund, a terrorism insurance fund, because we said the insurance industry shouldn't have to cover this type of risk. And I would say, while I think there's plenty that the private sector can do in terms of upping their game in terms of cyber defense, I think it is unrealistic and unfair, frankly, to expect private sector companies, public companies, to take shareholder dollars to up their level of cyber defense to be able to defeat a state-sponsored attack. It's not their job. It's not what they're there for. That really is the responsibility of your federal government. And that's where we have to have an honest conversation in terms of cyber defenses of who's responsible for what, how are we going to divide up the responsibilities, and what are those expectations? And that hasn't happened yet. There hasn't been that conversation. And I think there also should be a national insurance fund that backstops in the private sector a state-sponsored attack.
That's quite
Wouldn't you
fascinating.
agree? Wouldn't you agree that in that dialogue, you're going to discuss, you could also discuss what is the minimum degree of defensive measures that the private sector might be responsible for, and then the rest of the slack being picked up by the federal side. It's not that the cyber, not that the private sector has no responsibility.
No. And they absolutely, they have a business imperative, right? At a bare minimum, right, for some cyber defense. And I think that to Sam's point, there needs to be a very clear standard about the minimum basic that is expected by the federal government that you got to do for yourself, sort of heal thyself first.
Sorry, I just think that the Equifax hack is a prime example of both of these points, right? The Equifax hack was conducted by an incredibly sophisticated state actor. And yet the very poor security practices of Equifax have been well documented, right? The fact that they were storing high volumes of incredibly sensitive information of Americans in ways that they never sort of held on to a lot of that in the first place, and the handling was just abhorrent. So I think right there you see why you need to get at this from both angles.
John, I wonder, how likely do you think it is that the government would do this? How capable do you think it is?
Well, I'm sure our capabilities improve in this technological age. Everything improves rather rapidly over time, but there's been a political reluctance to sit down and have the conversation that Fran is referring to. And I find it slightly surprising. We've been talking about it for about 15 or 20 years. So, I mean, I don't know when we can hope that dialogue is going to start, but we really ought to have it.
No, and look, it's terrifying to me. Leon Panetta, when he was director of the CIA, and again, when he was the Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration, said his great fear was a cyber Pearl Harbor. If that doesn't concern you, right? I think he's exactly right. I think that is the great threat of our generation right now. And we have all the lights are blinking yellow. All the dots are out there to be connected. This is not brain surgery. We just haven't come to grips with it and wrestled this to the ground. And we are still, John and I left government in 2008. We were having this conversation. Multiple administrations have failed to wrestle this to the ground. And we are more vulnerable for not having done it yet.
We have a question from Donald Smith, who is a good friend of the Center for the National Interest. And he asks, our policy is to protect defense technology. Most of private technology does have defense implications. is there a way to protect national security with private crossover technology? Why don't you start, Fran?
Sure. So I think there are examples of where we have done this historically. And there is, I don't mean to suggest that there is actually real cooperation between the private sector and the government on these national security issues and problems. And while there's plenty of areas of disagreement and places we could improve, which is what you've heard us talking about, when it comes to national security issues, corporate America is by and large pretty patriotic, right? They all feel that they have some responsibility. If they have a solution that can be applied to a national security problem, they're going to bring it to the table. One, it's in their commercial interest to do so. The other piece of this is the government has become better about taking defined problems to the private sector and saying to them, this is a problem for which if you can help us find a solution, you'll be commercially rewarded. What I'm talking about is what George Tenet helped to found, Incutel, where it's basically a venture fund where it links up national security solutions and the government and the private sector. And so we have platforms to do that, to innovate together, to commercial advantage and to the government's advantage. We need to have more of it, and it requires the government's got to invest alongside the private sector.
John, do you want to weigh in on that?
I don't think I really have anything
Okay.
to add, no.
Sam? Are you there?
Sorry, I think Fran covered it well.
Okay. I had a broader question, my own personal curiosity, and it relates to something that you, Sam, just were alluding to earlier, which is and we were talking about the pace of technological change and that the regulations are unable to keep up. I wonder, for all three of our panelists, I was at a small meeting with the head of artificial intelligence at Meta, the fellow who invented facial recognition technology, and he was prognosticating extreme rapid change in the field of AI in the next 2 to 4 years, including what he referred to as augmented reality. Do you think that is our government ready for this, and is even our population ready for the changes that are coming down the road? If he's right, it's going to be extremely rapid. Why don't you start, Sam?
Gosh, so, I think this is one where right now, when I look at how the US government is looking to govern emerging technologies, there are two main lenses that we're focused on. And anything outside of that doesn't get a lot of play. One is the China threat, and the other is antitrust. The issues that we are going with the development of AI and the pace of rapid change that I think you're referring to, I just think that these are questions that are so much bigger. These are existential questions around what does it mean to be human? That if we are fixated on governing technology specifically through break up big tech, address the China threat, we're just missing the boat.
Very interesting. Fran?
So, sorry. So I agree with what Sam says. I think this has got real implications for very serious public policy questions. I'll give you an example. When it comes to DoD and targeting, artificial intelligence can analyze data, as we know, much quicker than a human being can. But I think consistent with our values as a country, you're never going to want a computer to make a targeting decision. We are always going to want to have what we call a human in the loop, right? Somebody to look at that and make a judgment about a particular target. That's one example of where artificial intelligence will make us better and faster. But there are going to be a host of moral and ethical questions, even in the public, for public policymakers, that they're going to have to consider. And I worry, because the natural inclination as public policymakers in the executive branch are wrestling with this, and I don't know, but I assume and hope they are, is going to be for Congress to decide they're going to regulate it. And I think that's a mistake. I think you've got to let the people who are working with the technology and the applications actually work their way through this. Congress has got an oversight responsibility, but they've got to sort of slow the roll in terms of their immediate reaction being to regulate.
John, what do you think about this?
Well, I don't know that much about the AI in its practical application, other than this issue of facial recognition. And I just would like to say on that, I remember when I was ambassador to the Philippines in the 1990s, that there were already some experiments being conducted in that area with respect to immigration issues and identity documents and so forth. But it seems to me it's taken quite a long time to actually deploy that technology. So now when you have global entry to come back into the United States, you don't have to put your passport in the machine or anything else. You just sit there in front of a camera and a little piece of paper comes out and gives you your permission to come into the United States. So now it's been deployed. But how fast are some of these other technology aspects of AI going to be materialized? I just don't think I have a good handle on that.
We have a specific question for Fran from Christian Witten, who questions whether Google is indeed as patriotic as you make out. Or he asks, didn't they withdraw from a Pentagon project? And why do you think Google is particular? Why do you think they're patriotic?
So it is a very good question. And I, for one, was one of the real warriors when it came to Google and Facebook and their responsibility. When I left government, I thought they were not doing their part in terms of the disinformation campaigns and all that sort of thing. I will tell you that Google has, they did very publicly withdraw. Having said that, many of these companies continue to quietly work with various agencies of the US government to identify patterns of disinformation. Microsoft was very public about identifying the rate of attacks by Russia against Ukraine, and they issued the recent report about attacks in the US. Those sorts of analysis and studies, because of their access to data, and that includes Google, they work with and provide that sort of analysis to the US government. And then the US government can take that and they use it in a myriad of ways, whether that's targeting, understanding the threat, creating defenses. And so quietly and behind the scenes, these companies are doing much more than they have ever done before, and trying to be better civic citizens.
Sam, do you have a counter to that or not?
I think I'd like to, not really a counter, but to focus on the question of patriotism for companies operating in China. I think this is something that's very trendy right now, to think that if you're an American company and you do business in China, you're unpatriotic, that there's a sort of zero-sum relationship between global economic integration and national security. And I just like to throw out there that I think that that's a false binary, and again, this is not very unpopular in Washington right now. So, but this is maybe a view that's not going to be shared widely. But the idea is, if you are, for American companies operating in China, that creates a layer of visibility that we lose otherwise. We talked again about the point of AI development, quantum biotech. It's important to understand what are counterparts, what are engineers, what are the leading cutting edge companies and players in China actually doing? Because if we're not there, we're flying blind, first of all. And so I think that, and also imagine, around Xinjiang, and there are atrocities that are taking place in Xinjiang. What is the relationship of American companies in China? No, should American companies be operating in Xinjiang? Absolutely not. How do we monitor supply chains in that environment? It's a critical question, and I'm glad that US policymakers are taking up this issue. I also believe that not having American companies in the China market at all means that there is zero accountability for that administration. And if we look at what reform and opening has done for China over the past several decades, it has in many ways prevented China from going down the path of a North Korea. So I think that it's really important to grapple with these questions in a more sophisticated way.
I'd like to turn to John on this because I'm really curious to see what he and Fran say. I mean, are we in fact going over the top in our stance towards China and in a way creating an enemy through an overly hawkish posture?
You're talking to somebody who went to Beijing in June of 1972 with Henry Kissinger to in the wake of the Nixon summit in Moscow, and I had the opportunity to sit in on some of Kissinger's meetings with the Chinese leaders, and I've watched the relationship develop since that time. So I guess I've been one of those who favored viewing the China relationship as a positive sum game, a win-win, as the Chinese like to say. And of course, that kind of thinking sort of took a different turn, maybe half a decade or a decade ago, and people started to question the value of the relationship. I think we've got to find the right balance. I think some of our sentiments towards China really relate to the fact that we're just apprehensive that there's another country that's developing into a peer with the United States on the global scene. I mean, China has succeeded in doing that. When we went to China, they were poor as church mice. They didn't produce anything. When we established relations in '79, I was in government at that time, and lifted the embargo on China, we didn't even know what we were going to import from that country. They weren't producing anything. And now, of course, the picture is completely different. And to another point, we still have $500 billion worth of trade with China today. So I think we have maybe over the top may not be the expression, but we're at a very heightened, we have an extremely heightened sensitivity to developments in China at the moment. And I think we tend to put them in the same bucket. People want to talk, you hear talk in this town, for example, Russia's war in Ukraine, but of course the real long-term adversary is China. Well, I'm not so sure the real long-term adversary is China. I think it's just going to be the long-term peer for the United States. So we've got to figure out how to deal with that. And hopefully our diplomacy will be skillful enough to do that in the years ahead.
Fran?
Yeah, look, I think we should be clear-eyed about acknowledging the current level of dysfunction between the two countries is in neither country's interest, period. It just isn't. And so we're going to have to find our path here forward. The problem is, in a world of no bipartisan agreement on anything, there seems to be bipartisan agreement on who can get to the right of whom on China. And that's unfortunate. And so in a world where we've got to solve the dysfunction, the political environment is not really all that conducive to it. To Sam's point about, look, our engagement with them has prevented them from becoming a North Korea. I think we should not overestimate our influence. That was the entire premise when there was bipartisan agreement that we should admit China into the WTO. And we thought that that was our way to influence China. And it did not turn out that they were abiding by the rules, and it had the influence in terms of the capitalism on the system and bringing them into the world in the way we thought it would. And so I just think that we should not, I think we often view diplomatic problems through the lens of the US in the sense of how can we influence things? I think we have to be modest in our expectations of how much we can influence internal Chinese decisions and policymaking. I think we need to focus, I think in the near term, in terms of solving the dysfunction, we ought to look at the places where we can cooperate. I think climate has been one of them. I think that there's reason to be optimistic that we can have conversations there. We have had discussions and positive conversations in terms of North Korea and work together. We ought to look at what are those basket of issues on which they are less controversial and see if we can make progress. And we ought to take advantage of that time period working on those less controversial issues to solve some of our own vulnerabilities, the things, to John's point, that make us nervous. We understand our supply chain vulnerability. We ought to create capability in the US. We ought to look at what we can nearshore in places like Mexico. And we ought to take advantage of that time, that trust building time, to solve some of our own vulnerabilities. That'd be my view.
Well, I think that's, I don't have any disagreement with that. Actually, I'm somewhat consoled because I feel like sometimes in Washington, I'm surrounded by China hawks, and it's sort of shocking how quickly that's developed. I'd like to close with a final question for all three panelists. We've looked at some of the big risks that are out there and that are widely discussed. Is there an underappreciated risk? Is there something that we should be looking at that we have not been? I'd start with you, Sam.
I think an underappreciated risk is how, if we ignore, I'll back up. And this builds off of Ambassador Negroponte's point. Coexisting with a powerful China in the world is in the US strategic interest. And the risks of not doing so, to me, are catastrophic.
Fran?
So while we're very focused on Russia, while we're very focused on China, pardon me, I think we should not sort of underestimate the conflict that we're seeing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is not about Ukraine. This is really, it is in the near term sense for Russia, and about restoring the Russian Empire. But this is really a threat to the global international order that's been in place since World War II. It's a threat to Europe. It's a threat to NATO. It will have implications if we do not deal with it, that will reverberate for the next 50 years. And so we have to be very careful not to cauterize it and say, well, this is a Russia-Ukraine problem. It has sort of pulled the Band-Aid off on Russia's ambitions. And while they don't have the economy and the capability of a China, I think we should not underestimate the size and the consequence of the Russia problem.
John, could there in fact be a Russia-China partnership that would challenge us on this?
Well, I think some of the steps we've taken towards decoupling through sanctions and so forth have had the effect of bringing those two countries closer together. And you've seen that manifested in the recent summit that they've had and so forth. Unlimited friendship and all that kind of terminology. So that is a problem. But and to Fran's point, I think right on. And we've got to, it goes beyond Ukraine. It goes to the question of our alliances and our friendships. And I think that our reaction to Ukraine has been very positive, and the response of NATO has been excellent, including also relationships with our allies in East Asia, Japan and South Korea. Long may that last. And I think that is really the question, because what if somebody other than Mr. Biden is elected to office the next time around, or 2 times from now, and has the kind of flaky attitude towards alliances that President Trump had, and our resolve and commitment could somehow weaken. And I think that would be very bad. So I hope the trend towards being more supportive of our allies continues.
Well, on that hopeful note, I think we should conclude this session. I'd also like to thank Kelly Myman from McLarty Associates for helping to arrange this session. There were a lot of moving parts to pull this together. And I think it was a rich and rewarding discussion. And I thank everyone for tuning in, and I thank our panelists. With that, we conclude.